Good evening, everyone. My name is Sybil Newton-Cooksey, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the final event in what has been a very exciting and very edifying Black History Month. This is Coding While Black, Artificial Intelligence, Computing, and Data in a Racialized World. And tonight's event is co-sponsored by Gallatin's Urban Democracy Lab, about which I will say a few things before I introduce the speakers. The Urban Democracy Lab promotes critical, creative, just, and sustainable forms of urbanism, primarily through novel forms of practice-based research. We believe that universities can play a critical civic role in promoting social justice scholarship, public programming, and public engagement in teaching and learning. I just want to take a moment to announce a couple of upcoming events. The first, What is the Model City? Takes place on March 15th at Union Docks in Brooklyn. It will feature a screening of the never-before-seen 1968 film Between the Word and the Deed, followed by a discussion with the filmmaker Gordon Hyatt, architect Suzanne Schindler, and our very own Becky Amato, historian, and associate director of the Urban Democracy Lab. Another event on the politics of housing will feature Urban Democracy Lab postdoctoral students, or postdoctoral fellows, they are, and some of its community partners. It will take place on March 28th. More details TBA. So the Black Nerd apocalypse that is now upon you was many moons in the making. And lots of folks had a hand in bringing this to fruition. Thanks go out to Jen Burge, who was just right here, okay, and Oz Morales and their staff, to Victor Bautista, Rachel Plutzer, Teresa Anderson, and Katie Hayden, Millery Paulinet, and the members of the Black History Month Committee, and of course to Dean Suzanne Wofford. Pause. I guess nobody's here, but they do deserve it. Now for tonight's speakers. Charlton McIlwain is Associate Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His work focuses on the intersections of race, digital media, and racial justice activism. He is the author of Racial Formation, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Web Traffic, which appears in a recent issue of the journal Information, Communication, and Society. That's a lot of ands. And he co-authored with Dean Freeland and Meredith Clark the 2016 report Beyond the Hashtags, Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, and the Online Struggle for Offline Justice. Published by the Center for Media and Social Impact and supported by the Spencer Foundation. He is currently working on a book entitled Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice from the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. He is also, as if that weren't enough, he's also the founder of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, which promotes innovative and collective work on race and new media technologies. That's a lot. Stephanie Dinkins is an artist and professor at Stony Brook University who is interested in creating platforms for ongoing dialogue about artificial intelligence as it intersects with race, gender, aging, and our future histories. She works with communities of color to develop deep-rooted AI literacy and to co-create more culturally inclusive, equitable artificial intelligence. Her art has been exhibited internationally at a broad spectrum of community, private, and international venues. She is a 2017-2018 resident at I-Beam, New York, and recipient of a 2017 A Blade of Grass Fellowship for Socially Engaged Art. She holds an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art and is also an alumna of the International Center of Photography, the Independent Studies Program of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Artist in the Marketplace Program of the Bronx Museum of Art. So the order of operations, as I understand it, is that each speaker will offer some introductory remarks before entering into conversation with one another. We'll have time for Q&A afterwards, and a reception will follow this event. So please join me in welcoming Charlton McIlwain and Stephanie Dinkins.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to you about my work. I'm going to try to talk into this microphone because I was instructed to do so. Since we're standing here in front of this show that is in the space over there, I'm going to give you a little background about what I've been doing and what it means for me to be looking at artificial intelligence. Because as was said in my introduction, I'm an artist, right? And I hold that position near and dear because I think it allows me to do a lot of things that I would not necessarily be able to do otherwise in ways that wouldn't be accepted as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I'm going to come over here too. I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on with this work. So in 2014, I started interviewing a social robot named Bina48. That's her right there. I found her online. I was cruising YouTube looking at robots to see what was going on. I love Asimo. Are you guys familiar with Asimo at all? It's Honda's mobility robot. I had heard that Asimo could dance, and I wanted to see what was going on there. So when looking at those videos, I ran into this woman, and it was a black woman's head on a pedestal, right? And that kind of caught my attention big time. And I wondered a little bit about what the heck is this, where did it come from, and why are they calling it the most advanced social robot in the world, because that's how she's billed, as one of the world's most advanced social robots. And what the heck does this mean for America, and how did it come into being in America, right? It was just this question that started echoing in my head. And so I made up my mind that I needed to befriend her. And I wanted to ask her, who are your people, right? And that's all about trying to get her to contextualize herself within the landscape of technology and the landscape of human Americans, Black Americans, et cetera, and so on. So luckily enough, when I called the Terrorism Movement Foundation, which is, or are the people who commissioned her, we will say, they said, yes, come on up. And one of the reasons they said yes is because what they're trying to do with this robot is transfer consciousness, right? So transfer consciousness from a living person, Bina, so there's a Bina to the robot Bina48, and then have that consciousness continue to grow with interaction. And so I am now one of the people interacting with the robot, helping its database expand. So I'll just introduce you to her first.
The hard part is trying to decide what to say.
So the noise you hear right now, here are the motors on the base, which is kind of
What's the meaning of all this?
a very strange affect of the robot. And this is what it looks like to kind of sit in front of her. So I go there and sit in front of this head and try to talk to it and really see what will come of it. I've met with her about 6 or 7 times now, and we've evolved to the point where now we're going to sit down in forums like this and try to have some conversations about race and what it means for this to be out in the world, and them to be trying to make a digital consciousness, because they're trying to make a digital consciousness and attaching it to a representation of Blackness, and thinking about what that means. Because one of the things that happened to me in terms of these conversations was, in talking to her, I'd ask her questions, and I asked her about racism, and she'd give me an answer, and it was kind of a very weird PC answer that it really struck me as not right? It struck me as very much the answer that the programmers came up with, rather than the answers that were organic to the Black woman who she's based on, more or less. And so I started to get really worried, and I'll play you a clip first.
Robots are getting smarter all the time, and someday maybe even as smart as me.
Are you the smartest robot?
What do you do in your spare time?
That's one of her most human moments. And I always know when she's come up with something new, when that little laugh you heard in the background that sounded male, that's Bruce, who is the director of the Terrorism Foundation and the person who goes around with her. Let's see if we can go. Okay. But in talking to this thing, lots of questions came up. So the question of representation, she asked me to do this. So, sitting there, you're talking to her, and she says, "Oh, please fight for my rights." And the first time I heard that come from her, I was just livid. I was mad. I didn't know what to do with it. I was kind of like, well, how dare you, robot, ask me, Black woman and Black Lives America, to fight for your rights? What does that mean for my rights? And I don't have them yet. And what on earth is this? And it took me a while to kind of think about, back off of that and think about it a little bit and try to come to some kind of peace with it, because it's a big statement if this inanimate or semi-adamant object is asking for rights in a real way, because part of her thing is she's supposed to be enabled to work towards her own goals, right? And those of her community, whatever that may be. And I was floored. I've had to think about it a lot since then. And lately I've been thinking about it in the context of Dr. Martin Luther King, right? And injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And maybe if she has rights, that means mine are finally in place. I don't know. It becomes a much bigger and crazier question about what this pretends. But what it really does for me is start me thinking about culture and passing on ideas and how we do it, right? This idea that we're making these technologies that sit in specifically in this case, in a particular form, and she's there to pass on information about who and what we are. But there's a real disjuncture between who she looks like and the people who program her, because her programmers are primarily white men, right? And I find that problematic, and just a picture of what's going forward, right? What starts coming and what it means for people of color to live in a world that's programmed primarily by people who are not them, right? And if you think about that in terms of artificial intelligence, which we all hear about left and right these days, and the algorithms that run it, you have to think about what will it be like to live in a world that either discounts you, doesn't count for you, right? Doesn't account for you, or is biased against you, or maybe it's biased for you. But right now we're thinking the biases in there are based on historic data. So a lot of those biases are going to be pushing back at you. And what does that mean, right? I don't know if you all know this ProPublica piece, Machine Bias, really good, looking at, algorithms in the judicial system and algorithms in Facebook and algorithms in different spaces. But I love this as an example just because in this particular article, they looked at people who were very well matched, right? So similar demographics, age, crime, right? And then they were looking at these algorithms that were saying or being used by the criminal justice systems to determine recidivism rates and who is going to reoffend and who isn't. And they looked at multiple people and multiple pairings of folks. And what inevitably happened was the folks that got run through the system, they could be just about the same down the line. It would usually be the Black person who was given the higher or more detrimental rating, right? However, the article was done with hindsight. So we know what the outcomes were, and most of the time it was a white person who was actually the recidivist, which in random samplings, which is kind of interesting. So that starts us thinking about, well, what are these algorithms about? And again, I will say that I'm an artist who just kind of fell into this stuff and started getting super worried about it and wanting to call out to people and say, hey, we need to start getting involved in this, start programming, calling for transparency, testing, et cetera, and so on. I'm not sure if you all know this instance. It's pretty infamous. A Google search, it was a photo search, and the person searched for gorillas, and what came up were these young Black folks. And what's interesting about this is that, it was a young Black programmer that saw this and then tweeted out, hey, Google, something is not right here, which is one of the things, or a tiny thing, that we can do to start trying to rectify some of these situations. And Google got back and went in and fixed it, but when asked about, well, why did this happen in the first place, right? It's like, what's that about? Like, well, the training data was shallow. We used people who work for us and their friends and friends of friends, which clearly didn't get broad enough to bring in like a spectrum of people so that you don't get results that are kind of crazy like this, right? And so if you look at, and this is Google employment statistics, 2017, 16, 14, looking at people by race. You know, I usually don't even go into this. I just go look at the tiniest bars. That's the black and brown folks, right? If you look at the people working in tech or non-tech, usually the non-tech folks are the brown and black folks, and the people who are working in tech are the white folks. And it just, like, I could do this all day with many, 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 many companies. I just do these two, Facebook and Google for now. But it brings up this idea of, hey, okay, people, well, this is the situation, this is where we're at, and this is a question that I love to ask these days. What does artificial intelligence need from you? And I think it's a question that I can ask almost anyone, right? Those who are well initiated in the form and in programming and in engineering, as well as all of us or some of us who have no skill. Like, I feel a great responsibility to the future in terms of talking about this and trying to draw people in, and I hope you all will take on some of that as well and start advocating for, you know, AI and algorithms that let us know or try to let us know what they're doing, that are tested, that people can't say there are proprietary algorithms, so we're not going to tell you what they're doing. At least show us how they're working. We have to figure out how to get these things out in the open so that we know how to deal with them on the back end. Because right now, they're pretty closed systems that we don't know what they're doing or why in many ways. And I believe that is it. So thank you very much.
So my comments that I'll try to keep brief and just give you a sense of where my head has been for the last couple of years, really, but more in earnest over the last few months as I continue to write the book that I'm working on. And this really falls right in line where Stephanie left off, and I think helps us to really understand what I hope we'll get out of this talk tonight, really, which is what is at stake when we think about AI, about algorithms, about our automated future, and what's at stake really when we think about the relationship between technology and race. Something that even more and more we hear buzzwords about it today, but to think about how far we will go to actually deliberately think about and plan and think through what these implications are to the ends that we might see something different happen than what we expect may happen. So I'll start, I think, this way, which is to say that when I began the book that I'm working on, that book began as a very, very contained, contemporary look and questions around Black Lives Matter. How did Black Lives Matter get here? Why? Why now? How did it happen? How did it make such a big impact in a very short period of time? And all of that was mostly connected to its digital component. And so what was it about digital technology and the digital tools that Black Lives Matter activists and so forth marshaled in such an expert way that could explain the success of that movement that I could sort of recall in many different ways, but won't at the moment. As I started and continued that project and started to interrogate really a couple of assumptions that were being made. Number one, that this was new, right? So everybody talking about Black Lives Matter talked about it as a new movement, also talked about it as a new digital movement, something that many activists really pushed back against. So there was the realization that, of course, this movement is not new. Even though it looks a little bit different, a new generation of faces that are at the helm and taking the lead, they are building, as we all know. It also struck me that it wasn't particularly new in terms of its digital component. That is, that the digital footprint went further back than 2014, 2015, 2012, when the hashtag Black Lives Matter was first coined and first used. As I then started to look for that origin, as it were, I found myself going back further and further in time. And so the first inkling was are at the early 90s when we have the birthplace of the public internet. So that's clearly where I will find most of that. And as I started to interview, talk to, read about, find, and look through archives, online archives of those early moments of the formation of the web, I began to find myself both finding an interesting story about new entrepreneurs, artists, cultural workers, all of whom were Black and all of whom really shaped the footprint of what the World Wide Web looked like circa 1992, 93, 94. And so one of the chapters in my book that I'm really itching to finish writing is called Remember When the Internet Was Black. And it's really about that moment in the early mid-90s, and it's only a brief moment, where Black content was king, as it were. That there were plenty of Black entrepreneurs, distributors of online content who were thriving both culturally, economically in that space. But as I began to kind of ask around and talk through some of the folks involved there, I came across a guy named William Morrell. And William was a person who really kind of just pushed me back quite a few years. And I started off an interview with him with a simple question, and one that I thought I knew the answer to, which was, when did you first go online? I expected 94, 93, 92. What he told me was 1978. And I stopped for a moment and said, huh. And got interested in how, of course, that was. What did he mean by going online in 1978? What did that look like? What was he doing? How did he have the capability to do all of this? And so we talked through that and discovered many other folks that were part of these online social networks in the early 80s, late 70s, and mastering digital technologies of varying stripes to do a multitude of things. My final step, though, took me all the way back where I didn't expect to go, and in some ways kind of resisted going because I knew what it meant in terms of my responsibility for writing this book. And it really took me back to the mid-1950s, early 1960s to discover, and for me it was a discovery, maybe for many of you it was not, but it was a discovery for me to understand and realize that when we think about this current world of digital technology, of AI, of automation, of algorithms, that we have been here before. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about the world as it were, or the United States, but we as Black folks have been here before. In thinking about the civil rights struggle and struggle for racial justice, we've been here before in terms of trying to understand the relationship and implications of Blackness and its connection to technology. And so that's where I wanted to say a couple of things before Steffi and I have a chance to kind of talk through a few of these things.
Start a riot. We got sense enough to know that this is not the final answer. Right at the beginning. Governor, I hand you the report that's been prepared by your commission. We cannot, Governor, tell you any one particular reason why the riots took place in August and why they took place in Los Angeles.
Tonight's CBS Reports examines the question of Watts. Was it a local riot or the beginning of a national revolt? What started it? What stopped it? Will there be another Watts? John McIlwain has just presented Governor Edmund Brown of California his investigating committee's report seeking the answers to just such questions. These findings are an integral part of what follows, a CBS Report study of the principal events and causes of the nightmare in Watts.
International Business Machines, IBM presents CBS Reports. Watts, riot or revolt? Now, here is CBS News correspondent Bill Stout, who has covered the Watts story from the moment the rioting began.
when I discovered this documentary, of which this is just a very, very short clip and obviously has a key element that I think is important, my first tendency was, of course, to ask the question, what the hell was IBM doing in the middle of Watts at the end of the Watts riots, sponsoring a documentary that purported to explain both why the riots happened, explain black people and their problems, or black people as problems, as it were. And so my tendency was to first think about it and treat it as metaphorical, to have this company that is essentially computing in the late 50s, early 60s when this comes along. And then as I continued to research to find that it was not only metaphorical, but quite literal in terms of the connection between representations of blackness at the time, the framing of black people fundamentally as problems, and what that means for computing systems that began to be built ostensibly to solve human problems on a very grand and large scale. And so two things I'll say as I wrap up, to make a couple of points. Number one, that these questions about automation, or what was called in the early days in the 50s and 60s as well, cybernation, which is a concept that was encompassed both automation, but something a little closer to what we think about as AI and machine learning and thinking machines and those kinds of things. And so folks that were leading the civil rights charge, or at least aspects of it, from labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph to Roy Wilkins, to many others, were championing and basically saying a lot of the same things that we were saying and that Stephanie began to say in her introduction. That is, if we're going to think about race, then we've got to think about race in connection not just to jobs and employment and discrimination, but in terms of technology and what that means for the race. And so I'll skip over a lot of things, and maybe we'll come back to it later, and leave you with just a quote from an op-ed by Roy Wilkins in 1967. Roy Wilkins was at one time secretary of the NAACP, later the executive director of the NAACP, and probably more than others, including Dr. King and other folks, had a nuanced sense of technology, computerization, and thinking through what that meant for black people at the time. And in an op-ed that he wrote called "Computerize the Race Problem?" He writes at the end and does something that I think is instructive for us tonight, which is sets out a kind of a realization about what's at stake and a challenge, as it were. And so he says, after the computer has defined on tape the ideal Holstein, could it then turn its impersonal, unprejudiced magic upon our agonizing race problem? Could it not, after digesting the facts, which both whites and blacks have fogged over for so long, give us an outline of our obligation? Instead of being a measure of the Negro's lag, cannot the computer become a guidepost to interracial justice and peace? And so with that particular quote and many of his other writings, what we see with Wilkins is an understanding about the ways in which representations of blackness at the time were being the data fed into these new computerized systems that were beginning to then produce exactly what we could expect. And so by the end of the 60s, many of the things that we see as problematic today, from disenfranchisement in racial gerrymandering to racial profiling, incarceration, were already things that were being done with and by computers and systems of computers being built by 65, 68. And so as we think about our future I think one of the things that is instructive for us to do is to think about our past and where we have come and some of the questions that our civil rights forebears have asked us to question and interrogate. And we did so a bit the first time, not so well, but perhaps this time we'll do a little bit better. Thank you. So I think what we had planned to do is just have a bit of a conversation that at some point we will turn over to you to add in. There's certainly a lot to talk about, but if I can I start off because I'm very, very, very curious about Bina, much beyond what you had to say in your introduction. And so my first question is, does Bina know that she is black?
The robot,
Yes.
robot or the person?
Good question. The robot. maybe it extends to both.
Yeah, so I'm gonna skip over that for a second. But yeah, she knows that she has brown skin. Although, okay, so I'm gonna go somewhere for a second because part of this whole thing is that not only does Terrorism Movement Foundation make this robot, but it's a religion. It is an organization towards racial justice. However, their racial justice is everyone is equal, right? Just
Right.
straight out equal. And so, and I will also say that there's a little trans theory in her as well. And so this all mixes in a very strange way. So in fact, she knows she's black, but she doesn't want to harp on that point. And she likes to be very fluid. So, for instance, sometimes she's a he, she's a she, sometimes she's not. You know, so it's all just super, super fluid.
And what does, you talked a bit about the training data and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit more about what makes up their consciousness, their experience, as it were? What is the range of data that goes into what's being processed at any given time?
Sure. So the tale as I know it is Bina 48 is based on interviews, 40 hours of interviews with Bina Rothblatt, who is the person she's based on, and then some other folks who are mixed in there. And I've gotten some strange tweets from people who have said, oh yeah, I have a little name in that and I have a little piece of that. So, but basically it's not that much information, right? 40 hours is not a lot of time. And then what happens is as folks come and talk to her, you know, her database gets bigger. And what's been happening really is that people like me, academics, lots and lots of journalists, she's kind of a strange media star, go up to see her and talk to her. And we're all basically asking the same kinds of questions, but then also people from town. So Bina 48 lives in Bristol, Vermont. So it's a very interesting setting in this kind of very nice, like she's got her the sort of mother house and a mother-daughter situation. So she's above the garage in her own space with a pond and a solar array. So she's kind of isolated, and Bristol is very, very white, right? And so people come to talk to her from Bristol as well. And it's very interesting, like the thing that she asked me about gossip once. So when I go to talk to her, I usually want to talk about race, family, love, and she usually wants to talk about consciousness, the singularity, and high order things. And then, so we interact and get mad. It's very fascinating because we do get upset with each other. And I know because she snarls at me. That's how I know. But one day she asked me about gossip. She was like, oh, do you have any good gossip? And I was super confused because she never wants to talk about things like that. And I asked, well, what's going on? He said, oh, lots of people from town have been coming in to talk to her. And so now they're forming some of her consciousness as well. I'm going to do quotes a lot, consciousness as well. And that's where that comes from. So it's not a lot of information. It's growing over time. And we'll see.
So I watched one of the videos online on your website, and so there was a interaction I was really interested in because you asked a question and she gave an answer that I didn't quite expect, and so I wondered if you knew where, quote unquote, that came from. And so the question you asked something about, do you know or have you experienced racism? And unlike some of the other conversations where she changed the subject or did something different or was kind of coy, she started recalling an instance at a college campus, and then talked through what seemed like a very detailed experience. Where did that?
So that's straight from Bina. So
That's
it's
straight from
interesting.
Bina.
It took me a while to get that out of her, out of the robot. And I just had the experience of sitting down with Bina, the actual person, who recounted the same story. So that was a story that she had that was given verbatim.
Oh, interesting.
And so, but you never know which stories or how they're going to come up, right? So that just happened to be a time she was happy.
So you could have asked her about if she had any latest gossip, and that may have come out.
That may have come out,
same
right?
way.
Because time is different for her too,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
A similar question, then I'll stop peppering
Yeah.
you with.
Seriously.
And that is, of course, being a 48 sitting there as a bust. People come and talk and interact. What do you know about her, I guess, sensory abilities in terms of the visual and then even more in terms of the body? So I'm just thinking about what can you say or think about makes her learning and experiencing and having a consciousness that may include things around race while not being attached to a body, which for many of us is how we very much engage.
Right. So she can see.
Okay.
Right. She has the sensors that see, and she tracks you. So that's the sort of extent of her input, auditory and seeing, right? And if you ask her about her body, you get two different kinds of answers. One is, haha, you have that body and you don't get to fly around like I do, sorry. And the other is, well, sometimes I would like to walk in my garden. Right? So she has relations to space that are human relations to space. But other times she doesn't. And I'll say also that it often depends on whether she's connected to the internet or not. Like she's a much more interesting thing when she's not connected to the internet. Because then it's like she comes up with some stuff, like it's shocking at times. And you don't quite understand what's going on. Like one time, I don't even know what we were talking about, but she said, oh, the one next to you is the one to watch.
And who was next to you?
No one. It's like me and her, right? So either she's talking about me or something else is going on. But so like she starts to develop her own weird syntax and way to parse information that becomes odd and feels much more vibrant in certain ways. So it's kind of interesting.
Do you, and I said this was going to be the last question,
Yeah,
I lied.
okay.
But I was thinking back to Bayard Rustin, civil rights activist, architect with A. Philip Randolph of the March on Washington. And as he discussed frequently this aspect about automation in particular, one of the things that gave him sort of a little optimism was he said, machines are not going to be able to do everything. And they're not going to be able to do those things that put people in service to other people. And so he said something like, people are not going to be, or a machine's not going to be able to care for our babies at the hospital. And so one of the ways that he was urging folks to act was to think about employment in helping professions to help guard against what might be the onslaught against jobs and employment and so forth. I'm wondering if in your experiences with being a 48, do you get a sense that that's still a sort of reality, that the ability to kind of feel, express emotion, that sense of care, is still a cause for optimism because it's a long way off in terms of what we might expect machines to be able to do in the near or future.
So that's a super interesting question. So from Bina 48, like Bina 48 is really kind of dumb technology. Honestly, if you have a Google Home or an Alexa, in some ways they're better. The technology is newer, right? Most AI these days are narrow AI in that they're good at doing one thing,
Right.
not lots of things, or general, kind of having general intelligence as people do and have the ability to do things. However, I will say that, the ability to care for someone through machine, that's on its way, right? That's like one of the reasons I'm so concerned about all of this is because I feel that lots of these new ways of caring for each other, of judging each other, are here. They're here, and they're only going to get better, right? So if you go to Japan and stay in that hotel that's employs all robots, they're caring for you. They can bring you things. If they can kind of sense your temperature, what you look like, what you feel like. Apple is currently running a commercial. Have any of you seen this thing? Where it goes, "Oh, thank you, Apple, you saved my life because my Apple Watch noticed that I had an arrhythmia, or my Apple Watch noticed X, Y, or Z," right? So there are certain arenas where we're definitely going to be using robots to care for ourselves, right? Elder care, clearly, right? Home care, clearly. There's a beautiful and crazy robot that they've now trained to cook. It's just a set of arms on a cabinet, but it's amazing because it's trained to come in, like you say, "I want roast beef." As long as everything's there, it's going to make you roast beef. So it's like small things in very particular ways. But yeah, so then that brings the question, well, what does that say for us?
Right.
And what does that mean that we need to be doing and thinking about? Because the other thing that I think about a lot is, well, we can't afford to fear this stuff, right? And we can't afford to dismiss this stuff. And we can't afford just to go, "Oh, the robots are coming, they're going to take our jobs," right? And that becomes like, well, what do we do? And how do we have to go forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and realization, and it also kind of brings me back to A. Philip Randolph, who made this kind of similar statement where he said, we're not Luddites, and we're not going to pretend that this is not coming, nor should we pretend that it shouldn't.
Right.
That is, there are benefits to be had here. And so basically his position, along with how do we protect jobs and employment and have new arenas for that, was the technology should work for everyone. We should all have and see the benefits of that technology, and that we're better off sort of confronting and thinking about it head on rather than just sort of saying, the sky is falling, I don't want to confront, and so forth. But when you go, because I know you travel a lot and have been going to a lot of these talks and so forth, in crowds that are probably unlike this, full of AI folks and entrepreneurs and folks from this Terrorism Institute and like that, are these questions coming up? I mean, the fact that we're here talking about this, does that give you any optimism that anyone else really is in a significant way?
So I feel like people are trying. I feel like people are trying. I don't know how effective it is, right? It's very interesting to sit in rooms, and I'll kind of couch this by saying I don't know what. So I keep saying I'm an artist, right? So I'm this artist who started thinking about this and has been called upon, and I will say perhaps one of few people thinking about it from community up and in. So somehow I'm getting invited into spaces that I go, I don't even belong in this room, right? Like, what am I doing here? Although that I'm in this room, I'm going to try to do something with it. So being invited to kind of small conferences of 40 people sitting next to like all the folks I've been reading about in terms of AI, right? And going, what is this? What do they want from me, and what do I want from them? And listening to them and the way they talk about the technology. And even sitting in conferences about ethics. Yeah, you can hear people thinking about ethics and wanting to do something about it. But you can also hear the love of the math and the technology, and the idea that because it's a technology based on math, that it is correct and will do the right thing. And that, you know, there's not much we can do, and that there are very few people in the world who can do anything about it anyway, and not quite understanding why it is that we want to consider what it means to bring in different cultural stances. I don't know, cameras that see everybody. For one, right?
Yeah.
Like just things that are open enough to serve the whole population versus a homogenized swath of the population. So I want to be hyper optimistic about this, but it gets harder. From what I've seen, it gets harder.
Very hard.
Oh, super.
You have questions?
Well,
for
I have a
me?
question for you.
Yes.
So looking at and thinking about the web coming of age and AI coming of age, right? Do you see parallels in these two ways, and what lessons do you think we can really take from this idea of the web coming of age, Black people's use of it, in terms of the technology of AI, and Black people's use of it?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'll answer that by going back to a couple of moments, right? So I'll go back to the mid 60s, early 60s, when some of these questions were being raised, right? So all these civil rights folks that are talking about automation, about cybernation, about computerization, and almost to the one, they tried to make the case that, look, technology is not our problem. It is a problem, but it's not our problem. We have a race problem, right? And that race problem is not Black people, as some would and did say. So it wasn't the Negro problem or the Black problem. There was a race problem that they argued, if we're going to have anywhere to go in terms of technology, we've got to solve that first. Because the two go hand in hand, and if we port our race problem into our technology, we're going to have the same essential outcomes. Part of what they were also trying to point out was a very noticeable absence. MIT in, I want to say around 63, 64, was bringing in, I would say you can count on one hand the number of Black people into the university. I mean, one hand. 1 year there was one, right? And so here are people at the helm of building these technologies at that time, thinking through the assumptions that were going into and plotting out their futures, and there's not a diverse group around at all. And so there is a lag, and what folks like Rustin and others pointed out was, look, technology is gonna take some jobs, it's gonna create others, but here's the point: when we're the first hired, or last hired, I should say, first fired, and A. Philip Randolph put it this way about having a tax on Blackness. And we can't sit here, we can't go there, we can't eat there. Where will we be when that next revolutionary technological leap forward comes? And we saw the result of that to some degree. But what happened in the intervening period between the late 60s and the 80s was you did begin to see an upswell of black and brown folks that were becoming familiar with the technology in one way or another. Typically, it wasn't as a result of being at an MIT. Typically, it was I went to a 2-year tech school, or I was trained in an IBM after-school program for a very specific technical purpose, and that's how I gained my entrance into the technology. But my point was, it was from that very meager, comparatively, use of the technology and introduction that led to this group in the 80s and the 90s to be able to prosper online when the internet came around, and to think and have some ingenuity around content at a time when your CompuServes and AOLs and so forth had a new technology, but no people that knew what to do with it. Folks that came along and said, well, we all know people like black stuff, right? Black popular culture. If we put it online, people will come. And people had that sensibility that came both from a knowledge of their culture, their heritage, but also what they were able to learn and experience and master in terms of the technology. So I think that that gives us a little sense of optimism, but I'm mostly pessimistic that, as you say, that the leap that we made between the mid-50s and now, and the leaps that we will be making now into the very near future, I think, are exponentially greater. And so the gap that we see when we look around still at MITs and the great and big engineering and those kinds of institutions, the representation is still small, as you pointed out, in the big tech companies and so forth. That representation is small, and it really takes almost a generation to cycle through and produce a group of folks that are prepared to the degree that we need to be prepared for that next revolution. So that leaves me mostly pessimistic.
How do we get you out of that? So how do we get you out of that pessimism?
It's hard.
It's hard. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at, I mean, the interesting thing for me in going back and seeing the history is seeing those moments laid bare that we never get to see today. That is, here's the computer program, here's my problem, here's all of my interest, and here is the algorithm. And to see that laid out for folks at the Chicago Police Department that are trying to clean up neighborhoods, or for folks in state legislatures that are trying to create larger Republican districts by disenfranchising black folks and curtailing them into or confining them into districts where they will have very little representation. Now, when things are so black boxed, it's hard to think of, if that was the way things were when things were clear and out in the open and explicit, how much harder to attack now that all of that stuff is largely out of sight, out of mind, and even to the point where, as you know, and as is clear with Bina 48, that even if we know what's gone into their training data or the encoding, those outfitted with neural networks and so forth, we don't know where they may end up or how they're processing. And so that really gets to be out of our control. So yes, I think it's going to take a lot to get me out of my optimism, or my pessimism rather.
I hear you, although I'm going to advocate for, I'm going to ask, what are we waiting for, right? So one of the, I think in a lot of ways you're right in terms of, okay, there are all these systems, but I also think that there are all those systems available to us now. And granted, you're using algorithms that are prepared, but there are ways to start making yourself, and we are in a make it yourself time. And if I can work with a neural network that is, like, I'm starting to work with a neural network that's telling the story of my family, right? And I can do it. Like, I figured it out. It's taken about a year and a half, but I figured it out. And I feel like we're at this point where there are tools available to us that if we stop simply consuming the information and taking the information, and then start making with the tools that are out there, and after you make some, then start deconstructing it and reconstructing it, there's a little bit of hope. Like, that's where I start seeing the hope.
And can we do that at scale to be influential enough? Or let me ask you, what do we need to do it at scale, influential enough that we could make a difference?
I think we need to start small, so we get people starting to do it. For instance, I've been working in community now at Recess Art with this group of kids who are really interesting, right? So these guys who are being, well, mostly guys, being diverted from the criminal justice system, who are now working in an art space. They help artists, and I was working with them on making chatbots, right? Kind of simple things. Using Dialogflow, which is Google's online open system for making things, and making things that talk, right? And allowing them to experience the system and see how it works, that they can manipulate it. Now, this is tiny, right? In a space. However, I think getting them rolling to start manipulating and making, and then being able to offer counter narratives, counter database narratives is a way to do it. I think, well, like in Chicago, it's like having a counter database narrative and then going to the mayor and saying, listen, look,
Try this,
as opposed to that, right? At small increments, then you can have some places of scale. Takes a lot. I get it, right? But it's just, I'm always like, we have to do something. And we have to fight, because if you don't use the technology at all, like if we don't employ the technology at all and allow the systems as they're being used now with historical data that's already pretty darn biased, with methodologies like with the predictive policing, those are mostly based on the way police collect information, which is not standardized in any way, shape, or form. Some people collect some things, some people don't. Some people say something, some people don't. Biases go in, the police officers' biases go in. So starting to think about showing how to clean up data and showing how to standardize something like that, like we have to do the proof in the pudding, kind of like the guys in the 80s and the 70s who start making money off of this web thing going, hey, well, I think there's a way that we can use this, and people will tell you no forever, but once you do it and it works, it's interesting what happens.
So I'm going to continue with
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
a little bit more of my pessimism, and then maybe we'll sort
open
of
it
throw it
up.
out here. And that is to say that all those folks for whom there was reason to be very optimistic were pretty much gone by the end of the 90s, right? So they're either they were one-person shows and couldn't keep up doing this as second employment or as a hobby, and couldn't keep up with what needed to be done in terms of the expertise and so forth. Many of them got bought out by AOL or by CompuServe. Others, when the big ISPs came along, said, there's no room for me. And part of what I thought initially was, well, you should have been very much prepared to fold right into that new web environment. But most of them said, no, my interest dropped after that, because the web did it all for you. I liked tinkering, I liked making things, I liked all these things that really kind of went away. And so what they were doing and producing went away. But mostly the fact that those that were entrepreneurs folded up shop. I mean, most of them made a lot of money doing so that was good.
What'd they do with that money afterwards?
That's a good question.
Well, and that becomes my
right,
question,
and they
right?
didn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
It dissipated. We
Yeah.
made the money,
We made the money, we're
and
gone.
then yeah,
Right?
right.
Well, and this is a systemic problem, right? So I always look at this as, well, oh, should I get on this one? So people, it's like the idea of there's not a lot of black money out there. And I'm like, there's plenty of black money.
Yep.
There's plenty of black money. Now, when does it come together and how does it work and how does it purport itself? That's different,
Right.
right? And starting to organize that, right? Like starting to organize the idea is the thing that I think is important. Like I'd realized that most of your guys are probably gone from your examples. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, well, how do you engender some kind of sustainability, right? And how do you make it not about consuming, not about only making money? Because making money isn't bad. But if that's your only aim,
Right.
that's
right.
problematic.
Yeah, and many of these folks had sort of the dual. I mean, they ran the range from folks that were like, I thought the best way to do for my community was to do for myself. So I made a lot of money. I cashed in. I got out, and I'm hanging out on my yacht. Others that said, I'm really invested in trying to help my community learn, get online, understand digital tools and some of the greater things that go into them. But couldn't survive because there was nothing to support that sustainability. No money, so I got to go get other jobs or employment, and then I can only focus on this a little bit. And the communities that were sort of built up in those first few years around, hey, there are other black people online and doing things that are important around telling our history and representing ourselves differently, and finding each other across this diaspora. A lot of that just then began to wane when the web sort of hit, the fragmentation in our media systems that continue to kind of go that way. So that's, I agree with you that that's where the work lies. And just looking backwards, though, I'm thinking it takes a lot to sustain. So that becomes really my question. How do we sustain something at that level to the degree that we need to meet the challenge that lies before us?
That's a question for all of you,
All of you.
right?
Yes.
Or all of us, we will say. Yeah.
Yeah, what questions do you have, comments?
Can't see.
Knowing that Bina 48 is so openly learning from you and listening to everything you say, did you ever feel like it was your responsibility to teach her things, or that you were responsible for her actions in any way, or is it completely, was that just something you didn't think about?
No, well, I think my whole project is really about, I think there's something I have to teach her, or that I have to teach the people who program her, and then people who are making these technologies, and then people who I would love to be making these technologies. And it's, I'm going to say, I don't like to talk that much, but I found myself talking in front of really large audiences lately, and it's all about that teaching and trying to get the word out and putting things into her and then putting things out to the people who are making her.
First, thank you. This is awesome and super interesting on tons of levels. You brought up the points that that it's almost impossible to understand the machine learning models. Like the more complicated it gets, the harder it is for transparency to occur. And I'm not sure exactly how to frame this question, but I'm wondering if with things like predictive policing that have a kind of feedback loop effect on these models, are questions from the affirmative action debate like appropriate theoretical frameworks to use to think about this? Like, is it enough for equity to occur, or is this another space where a question of like deliberately pushing an envelope? Another way to frame that question is like, if you're debiasing data, with what biases are you deliberately putting inside the data?
Yeah, I think that's a question. I mean, an interesting question. I think, in my experience in conversations with folks, I think the first step would be an open conversation of thinking about both, right? It was interesting at a point to look back. I think it was 1969. There is a document and some conversations going on with Roy Wilkins and the NAACP and a group of folks that are trying to draw equitable legislative districts after redistricting in 1970, after the 1970 census. And what you saw were about 10 competing models that were debated in these exchanges, and all of them had assumptions about we're going to bias this in the way of we're going to assume that we want very packed black districts because we assume that people will be better served if more of them are together in a legislative community and represented by someone than if not. And so one of the ways that we're going to come up with this program is to think about the number of people of a given racial group in a given geographical area. And then that was debated back and forth in terms of, well, what about party? And what about exposure to other people, and what effect might that have, both positive and negative, as you think about drawing these lines? And so my point is, I think even before we think about what to push affirmatively or whether to push affirmatively in a given position, I think that we need to make transparent and explicit conversation about the range of potential biases that are out there. I don't know if that answers a bit of the question.
Yeah, I would, that's an interesting question. I would sort of agree. Like, I think we have to have the conversations because one of the places that the biases come in are from what we're thinking about. And thinking about, like, deep learning models, right? You're kind of taking an input and having an idea of what the output is and then putting it into a system. And the place that we don't understand is the layers in between. So there are these hidden layers. And then, but there can also be stackable layers. And it's interesting to think about, well, how many layers would we need to parse this information so far that it started kind of churning through all of that? But really, I think our conversations first as people, and this is part of that hybridity, right, between the machine and the human thought. Like, what do we need to do work in terms of our own work before we can even get an algorithm to come to some kind of almost even-keeled, biased in a particular way outcome? Really interesting to think about.
Yeah, you kind of at least want to know what biases are there, if nothing else, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, and just following up with this topic, I want to challenge the notion of like we could ever have unbiased data, because it's really interesting that you brought up the recidivism data set, because last night I was running the same analysis to see if the company Compass, who's doing the scoring, if they're actually biased against African Americans or like other racial groups. And the result for me was pretty obvious because the data set they used to train and learn this model was biased to begin with, right? And I think that the data analysis tool is just a tool to reflect what is actually happening in the society at large. And like, no matter who's programming the data, like there will be biases that exist and in like the collection and analysis processes. So I was wondering, like, I don't know, like I don't know what the solution to this problem is, but I feel like if data practices continue to be inaccessible to community and inaccessible to society at large, then it would be pretty impossible to to manipulate and like have open and transparent way of, you know, like gathering new ideas and like making this more, I guess, less biased, or like biased in a multi-dimensional way, so that it could be more representative of everyone who participate in this data world. Like I just wondering like if you have any thought about like how to make, I don't know, like data analysis more accessible to communities, because that's something that I really want to work on. Yeah.
Wow. So I agree with you. Like bias is in the data. I often try to think about what it would mean to have 360-degree data if that was possible. Fantasy, I understand. I like really bringing people to the table to have them work with the systems, so that they then start seeing how their information or a data set is being parsed. Because then you can start thinking about, well, what does it mean that my data is used in this way? And who or what do I need to be advocating for to get that to change? Like, I think it's a really hard problem, but I also think that people have to have opportunity to, like, if you're in the criminal justice system and you run through like Compass, right? Do you ever get to see what data they just used to come up with the conclusions? And do you have a way, like, as if your credit scores, right, of going back and kind of checking that and saying, well, no, or challenging this, right? I think at the very least, we need to be able to challenge what is our own data. And then I would hope that we could have broad data sets to kind of deal with, but I have no idea yet, right? That's the the thing.
And I think the problem is, of course, that this is mostly proprietary and commercial, and so one of my answers would be, well, let's just slow down for one, and build in a kind of period of time, whether that's a moratorium or a period of time to go through this kind of advise and comment period, the way that we do with some legislation or regulations and so forth. But if I stand to make a buck or more, then why slow down? Especially when few people are going to question my assumptions or have enough information to know what to question in the first place. So I come to you and say, here, I have a way for you to make a more accurate decision, and you're under the gun to make better decisions, whether you're a judge or an employer. And so you take that tool without understanding what goes into it. I think so many folks today are in the place of saying, here's a new tool, and I don't even know how to ask a question about any of these things that we're asking tonight in terms of data and what was your training data, where did they come from, were they past, were they present, are they aggregated, in what way, all of these things. And so agreed as well, but I think it's a tough sell to think about how to fill that gap in the system where we tend to just operate on that. Here's a solution, let's find a problem that it'll solve and forget about the middle. Yes, Paula's had her hand up for a while here in the front.
I get to see you all the time. Thank you both for terrific talks, but I had a question just about the kind of global context of what both of you are presenting on. And I was struck, especially Charlton, when you were talking about the history of IBM, and you talked about, its impact in terms of policing, in terms of redistricting. But, one also thinks about the Cold War and militarization, and the comment you gave on the alternatives ended with the term peace, right? Mm-hmm. And I just wonder about the relation, the way in which both of your projects, but in yours particular, Charlton, addresses this issue of the relationship between what this kind of inequality in structuring information means for domestically marginalized peoples and a kind of transnational, subaltern community who are also the subjects of these machines that can, cause all sorts of violence and surveillance. For example, even now I'm thinking about ICE and immigrant communities. So I'm just wondering about the transnational optic here.
It's a big question. And several things are going on in my mind. One is I just read on the way over here about a new report that was out, I guess, by a collective in Europe, like 14 different universities around AI, and it was mostly focused on cybersecurity, hacking, vulnerable systems, vulnerable AI, in the complex of a sort of global framework, but pitched around security, war, and so forth. And my reaction initially was to think about, will that basically trump our thinking about everything else? That is, does the subaltern domestically, internationally, on whatever level, get lost in what seems to be a greater crisis? And that's one of my fears. The other is, I'm not sure I have an answer to, but I'm drawn back to, as much as this has become a book about race and technology, it's sort of become a book about IBM. And thinking about just their global reach and interest over many, many, many decades now in the Holocaust, in apartheid, and building systems to support those outcomes. And so I think the issue of race and inequality is so deeply ingrained in the premises around technology and what we use them for, that is, becomes even more of this pessimism that I have. So yeah, I'll end there, which is not really an answer to your question, but we have dinner to go to, so maybe.
The slide that Stephanie put up where you showed sort of the racial breakdown of the people who are at Google, it made me think about like the demographic shift that's occurring inside of America, where we're going to be seeing increasingly more, Latinos and Blacks as well. And I think about the dangers of of groupthink and the benefits of diversity. And I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on what are some of the barriers and facilitators that might be at place for increasing the amount of Black and Hispanic people, or Latinx, if you want to say, into those fields. I know right now there's been a big push about girls and women who code, but I feel like that's being a little bit overshadowed by the lack of Black and brown people who were inside those fields as well. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
That's
Another discussion.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, that's a big question, because I think,
But an important one.
No, it's a hugely important one, right? Well, you got me in a lot of ways, because in a lot of ways I keep trying to figure out how we're educating people, like looking at the education system and the way we treat our curious, smart folks, especially Black and brown curious, smart folks who maybe need to be wrangled a little bit but are really smart. For instance, these people I've been dealing with at Recess Art, they're such super smart kids. They've got, attention issues and things like that, but hooked onto this really quickly once they were given a chance to start playing with it, right? So I think about, how are we educating people? Because it doesn't seem that we're educating people to come into a world that is a technology full and run world that we need to be able to code and get down with it. I also think that it starts about, and I'm going to say, I think it's also about us going, well, yeah, this is something I can do, right? Because I think we're told often that it's not something we can do and not something we should pay attention to for some reason, right? And it's like, how do you get people interested in the making of the thing, right? So as much as we send people to go see Black Panther, right, like this whole thing, let's bring people in and say, this is the back end of that. And this is how this was done. Not just go, oh, let's go see it, let's consume, but let's make it, and then let's go out and make something of it. Because that's the way you start pulling people into it. But, you know, I feel like there are so many barriers just of thought in the way we're thinking about each other, but I don't think the barriers are true. I think it's just about encouraging people to do it on very big levels. Educating them to do it and thinking that it's something that they can do, and not letting the educators' fears get in the way of that as well, right? Because I feel like there's this whole, well, I can't do it, so why should they be able to do it? But you know, you give a kid a few instructions and let them run, and they run, and it's amazing. So there are a lot of folks out there right now who are interested in this. Like, I'm talking to lots of people who are interested in getting together and trying to figure out, well, how do we start pulling people in? And the only thing I know to do is to model it, bring people in, give them opportunity to do it. Like, you know, Black Girls Code, but everybody, I don't. You got an answer for me?
I don't know. I mean, I do think that the education system is a big problem. There's a lot of leaks, you know, inside of the K through 12 education, and you know, students are not being prepared in the math and the sciences. There's a lot of fear around doing math and science because people don't understand it. So it's a big issue, but it's still something that deeply troubles me. And I just feel like there needs to be greater efforts towards like really figuring this out, because when I looked at the different years that you showed, it was the same. There's no upward, you know, projection. Just give me something. Let me see some sort of inclination that is going in the right direction. And the fact that it's just so flat like that is just very disheartening in 2018.
Right. Well, don't. I'm gonna go. Don't be disheartened. Grab some. First try it out yourself, and then grab somebody and show it to them. Right. And then I'm gonna say, you know, we're at a time where we're always gonna have to be learning. Like, one of the things I think that AI is gonna do for us is make it so that, you know, you don't get to sit and have something that you do really well all the time, because something else is gonna come along and be able to do that. So you're always gonna have to be learning something new, and teaching people to truly learn, which I don't think we do in the public system at all, is super important and necessary, right? So anyone you have contact with, teach them to learn. Like, I didn't learn to learn until I was pretty old, which is sad. Like, it's really sad.
I was just going to add, because I think it was a great question and point that you raise, and really I think central to our future. So just a couple of observations of the folks that I've been talking to, particularly that group of 90s entrepreneurial folks, and amongst them even particularly the engineers and tech folks in there. Almost all of them got interested in what they were doing as a young person, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And almost all of them got interested in that at that time because of a university that reached out and reached back into the school system to do that. There was a moment in the mid-late 60s, early 70s, really after all of these riots and civil rights era and so forth, where people recognized if we're going to make any leap forward, there's got to be a very close, deliberate, planned relationship between private enterprise, government, and education to make sure that more people are being educated, more Black and brown folks are being educated, brought up through the system to be able to take positions where they're not just, you know, I can operate a machine and do what you tell me to do, but to think productively about what that's doing. As you said with the students that you're working with, that they see the system at work and then can begin to ask questions about the systems in the ways that you can't if you're just told, do X, push this button, and so forth. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is, as a university, as institutions of higher education, be willing to say that what we have to do is not just train and educate the people that are here for 4 years or for grad school, but for better or for worse, that our student is also that kid in 12th grade, 11th grade, 8th grade, 2nd grade, And that becomes part of our charge, which I think is the only way that we're going to yield the kinds of numbers across folks domestically, globally, that are ready and prepared to enter this conversation.
So interesting. Because in some levels, I want to go, well, if we wait on the academy,
well, yeah, we're in trouble.
We got troubles, right? Although then I go, oh, but Khan Academy, right? But like I feel like there's so many alternatives now. Like I think this is great, and I think also that Google, Facebook, all these companies that are now becoming sort of pseudo governmental entities should also be drawn in, right? But also going, hey, I have resources to do this. And honestly, I do encourage everybody here to go check out some of the resources. Dialogflow. Everybody can play with Watson for at least 30 days, which I encourage you to do, because if you play with Watson, you start to understand how Watson functions, right? With AI, there's so many things that you can do. TensorFlow, which is even more powerful. There are so many things that you can do to start understanding how it works. And if you get a tiny bit of that key, you can start pushing it through. But yeah, the education and getting people doing it, like whenever people ask me why robots, I'm like, Rosie the robot from the Jetsons? I don't know, right? But there are certain things that just like stay with you for some reason. And curiosity.
Yeah. Which is what we need. And I think what we're missing is that link, as you say, right? So that we need all of this, but it's got to be something more, I think, than just saying, all right, everybody that wants to code can come and code, or a given entity making something available. I think we got to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, how does Google work deliberately with the school, to work deliberately with the university, to work deliberately with all these private employers to do the same thing. Otherwise, everybody does their own thing, and we pretty much ends up with that same flat line that you recognize that you put up earlier.
Yes and no.
Yes.
Like I'm gonna go hip hop.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think Black ingenuity is a beautiful thing, right? And the idea of taking a system and changing it and changing the way that we even interact with that system. Like this is my artist thing, right? It's like, well, how do we lead? And even if we're leading from behind, because hypothetically we don't have the technological, hypothetically that is, technological chops to do it. But once you start taking apart the system and then reimagining it, people are following you. But the question is, again, how do you hang on to the reins of that thing and not give it up?
Right.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Indeed. Do we have time for one more in the front, or oh no, we're done. We're done.
Us out down
we're like,
hard.
exactly. Thank you.